anybody who comes to me with Christian nationalism or Catholic nationalism, I see the same as I see the mullahs. To me, they're nothing but a mullah with a cross. And if he happens to be one of these guys, let me put him back here, I'm okay with them until they want to impose their shit through City Hall. I don't like religious parties of any color.
It has no place in American politics. It really doesn't work. If people want to group themselves around a religious ideal, they're entitled to do that, but they just have to understand that people who don't share that religion aren't necessarily going to be receptive to it. And it's unnecessary. As you said, we know that, in fact, I had this discussion with Michael Knowles. I said, how are we going to decide, Michael, you're Catholic, how are we going to decide that Satanists can or can't have a flag at City Hall in Boston, compared to others? Do you think any of them for a second? I mean, they didn't even think that applied to atheism. He says it's not a. He says these were people were not.
I don't know. There is a letter from George Washington to Tank Tillman that would argue otherwise.
Yes, that he wrote to the Newport congregation.
He was asking Tank to send them workers.
He was asking who?
Tank Tillman.
Oh, okay.
A friend of his. And he says, if they be good workmen, let them be Christians of any sect. Let them be Muslims. That's the way he wrote it, Sorry about that.
That's what they used to call Muslims.
Or let them be atheists, if they be good workmen. So his litmus test was not the religion of the candidate, but his ability to perform the task at hand. And that tells you a lot about how he saw these things.
Washington doesn't really get enough credit as a thinker. There has been a little bit of a movement to sort of knock him off his pedestal as well, because that's always the move, of course.
Over my dead body.
And they took Jefferson's statue out.
If he had seen what New York City Hall has become, he would probably run all the way back to Monticello, burn it down, and move to England. Right. I think that anytime now they're going to get Nathan Hale out of the... Nathan Hale is right across in front of the steps to City Hall, and he must be so uncomfortable there. He gets a full view of who gets in or out. And he's probably thinking, and I got myself killed for this.
Washington said this whole system is premised on people believing in God. And in other words, people having basically a
moral foundation.
A moral foundation that we can recognize. There are multiple levels to that, right?
Yeah.
All the way at the bottom of this, we have this gigantic movement towards nihilism, that is probably right. But they act out in a way that Christians haven't acted out with each other.
The nation tribe.
Do they track in any way the Sunni and Shia split? Or is that...
There's more than Sunni and Shia split. In Nigeria, in most of Islam, it was practiced by some tribes in Nigeria and by some tribes in the Amazon, actually. No relationship that we know of.
In the West, in Europe, of an inclination to be religiously discriminatory. Or George, when Washington said this is for a nation of believers,
yes,
he notwithstanding what he wrote to his friend in the letter about getting the job done, he didn't contemplate the kind of...
no, he wasn't talking about Catholics either.
He certainly wasn't. But we had the Catholics discussion on our last stream.
Yeah, well, no, but this is in Washington's context. It's a very difficult thing because I believe few people have been condemning terrorism in all of its forms as I have for the past 40 years. I don't think it's an Islam problem. I think it's an ideological problem. It's not a religious problem at all.
Right. So that is really the news story of our moment, which is that common cause has been made by two groups who, if they were to get their way, would undoubtedly be at each other's throats, which is Marxists and Muslims.
Isn't that interesting?
And by Marxists, I mean the very
broad collectivists. But the thing is that, remember how the Soviet Union supported, empowered, and virtually created the Palestinian movement, which was supported by Hitler before that. as the Arab-Palestinian movement. This association goes back to the beginning of these problems, and they have a lot in common. Now, I agree, it's like Hitler joining the communists only to end up at each other's throat. In the end, they will. But they will when it's time to partition the spoils. Because in the meantime, like Johann von Leers, and I use the word with misgivings, was an intellectual of Nazism. Misgivings because I hesitate to put intellectual and Nazism in the same page.
Yes, because at its core, it was an anti-intellectual movement.
Exactly.
And despised intellectualism.
But von Leers is the guy who wrote 53 books on the ideology of National Socialism. He ended up in Argentina as Perón's protege. In 1955, he moved to Cairo.
Yes.
In his goodbye letter to the Nazi community of Argentina, a very large one, I might add, he says that the deposition of General Perón by the Revolution of 1955 has made our dreams of a Reich unattainable here. And therefore, I am moving to Cairo, the epicenter of a wave of green flags from Morocco to Baghdad, fighting against colonialism, imperialism, and for social justice, which represents our only hope to restore the Reich. Boy, was he right.
I'm sorry, was he right?
Osama bin Laden's fatwa against the U.S. is a tirade against imperialism and a call for social justice that would make Ocasio-Cortez sound tame in comparison.
What you're saying is an articulate and well-informed version of what I said 5 minutes ago, with lots of fine detail, which is that there is an alliance of convenience now, that it's the people who want to destroy this civilization versus people who have different ideas of what to do with the remains. The irony is, it's a cliche. Please forgive me, people. There have been cliches in this. Liberalism is premised on tolerance, on pluralism. But what people didn't understand, and as was just pointed out by AKA Batusai in the YouTube comments, is that the premise was that we're going to be tolerant, we're going to be pluralistic, we're going to have that big tent, but we're all operating under the same moral framework.
Yes.
And I know Jewish people who don't like the term Judeo-Christian, and I know Christian people who don't like the term Judeo-Christian because there is a disconnect, obviously, between Judaism and Christianity.
At one point in history.
The point is, compared to almost everyone else in the world, we are basically sharing the same values of how to go about setting up a society. I'm not talking about the Crusades.
Please don't. I have enough idiots come to me with a 1400-year-old war.
It's the 21st century.
Yeah.
We were doing so well. It's really something else, Saul. At least we won a case against Disney this week.
Baby steps. In order to catch a big lion, you start with a small mouse, or something to that effect. It's not the one thing that keeps me awake, but it's the one thing I think about when I am kept awake. One thing we cannot forget is that the primary target of Islamic National Socialism is not us, it's other Muslims died in the past 10 years alone. While the left in Europe and the US talk about genocide, 500,000 were killed in Syria, way over 300,000 in Iraq. Nobody's counting the Muslims murdered by the Chinese.
Nope. If the Jews didn't do it, no one gives a crap.
Nobody gives a shit. Whether it is in Western China or in Syria or in Libya or in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of Muslims who died fighting with us against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, nobody counts them. And we cannot win this battle without them. So I always think that people who generalize about Islam and put in the same position the terrorists of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or Damascus with the hundreds of thousands who fought and are fighting alongside us, the 2 million Arab Muslim Israelis. A general condemnation of Islam condemns the Muslim Bedouins fighting in the IDF. I think it's a grotesque injustice.
And it's one, you make a very good and important point, and it's also an injustice that, to a large extent, Muslims, understandably, have some responsibility for, because they have been reluctant to break ranks. There's a growing consensus in the Arab Muslim world that it's time to stop playing footsie with Hamas, because they're nihilists. There's nothing's good enough for them, and they will ruin everything.
I think you're too generous with them.
But now we have this rumors that the British are about to recognize a Palestinian state, and Biden threw up in order to see what kind of reaction there would be to the U.S.
Oh, a trial balloon.
I mean, everything.
Oddly enough,
really
I'm waiting
good.
for the other shoe to drop. And it has definitely something to do with Jews, but not exclusively. European social democracy is fundamentally anti-Semitic, collectivist. I tend to say sometimes that the Nazis managed to get with the euro what they couldn't accomplish with the Panzer. Are also collectivists, anti-capitalist, I would say anti-liberty with a capital L. We have them in the US as well. You can see the results in our universities, in our State Department. It doesn't surprise me at all that ideas coming out of the State Department almost invariably are injurious to Israel. And I think it's by design. Yes. Like I said, social democrats are intrinsically, viscerally anti-Semitic. And they don't need to be Muslim, to do that. They're worse. I think Israel is in better hands with Saudi Arabia than with the American State Department today.
People to acknowledge the difference between Saudi Arabia today and Saudi Arabia in 1984.
They refuse to see the changes, and they're dramatic. So, we look at these things and we see how averse these people are to any sort of liberty in the American sense, not in the French sense. This you can trace back to the French Involution. It led to very bitter disputes between Adams and Jefferson, and Adams was right. And Jefferson had to admit it.
Jefferson was willing, and he really did set a pattern for modern liberals, willing to overlook the nihilism inherent in what, as Lenin formulated it, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet.
He was willing to overlook the reign of terror.
Right.
And he thought that the French Involution was a projection of the American Revolution. He was wrong. It's a different monster.
Yeah, there's no comparison.
It started as such.
Right.
Yes. For about 10 minutes, when Lafayette convinced the king to call the estates, and the king named Lafayette, the hero of the American Revolution, as the commander of the royal forces to ensure the peace during the process. And eventually there was a counter-revolution. Lafayette ended up in exile in Austria and was jailed. Thomas Paine ended up condemned to the guillotine. And Thomas Paine's friends managed to spring him out during the confusion that followed. Some people say he was sprung out of the Bastille, forgetting that the Bastille had already been burnt. That would have been a sight to see. But when the French Revolution calls for liberté, égalité, fraternité, it sounds, pretty much like liberty, equality, and except that our equality is equality before the law. Their equality refers probably more to the size of the dick. Put it more seriously, they speak of equality of means, and we speak of equality of opportunity.
Absolutely get lost. And our government and our leaders and our judiciary and our academia, all the elite institutions have bought into it. And it's...
You say, how do we guarantee freedom of religion? In 2000, they passed a beautiful law, the sects law, which prohibits the practice and ritual of sects within the territory of, not sex, mind you, that one is still free.
That's what we're talking about. We're talking about France, after all.
And it prohibits the practice and rituals of sects within the territory of France. Now, what the crap is a sect? You, having an inquiring mind, may ask. How does the French government determine what is a sect and what isn't?
To which the French government says, I don't know, but we're not going to despair of trying.
The Minister of Interior is the one that says, from now on, you're a fucking sect.
Look, it's a problem. It's a problem because, then you're ultimately giving the power to the state, which is
what the French have been doing all along.
Well, that's right. Look, we talk about freedom of speech, which is much, that's my topic. So, I've had a couple of people from the UK as guests on my program, and we have talked about, they don't have a First Amendment in the United Kingdom, and they have had some
nowhere in Europe for that matter.
We're really pretty much anywhere, and they have more of a problem with censorship and people literally being arrested. I mean, one of my guests was Count Dankula.
You can be jailed in most of Europe for the utterance of one word.
We can see the problem with that. But having said that, and I'm not suggesting that at the end of the day, just how much has the United Kingdom suffered from a lack of freedom of expression in the last 100 years? Maybe someone has done that stuff. We're living in such an open system.
The question is upside down, is a proving of the negative. You can never prove the negative.
Yes, well, right, of course.
Now, it's not fair to say that there is no freedom of speech in England, because to a great degree there is. Specific areas where you cannot venture.
Why do freedom of religion and freedom of speech live together in the First Amendment? Why shouldn't they be two separate amendments?
Because it's freedom of conscience.
That's right. And what happens? There's no constitution. There's no written constitution at all in the UK. They will decide based on their internal feelings, like so many of our judges do now.
Pure jurisprudence.
Traveling through jurisprudential space, they'll decide what is nice and what is inappropriate. And these are hard questions, but as long as we're struggling with them, there is some hope, and we are. And, and to go back to the beginning of our discussion, in Argentina, at least they're struggling with important questions also. I mean, for all the unhappiness that a person can quite reasonably have with democracy, it is possible for a democratic system to get fed up before it actually collapses on itself. Now, that might be too late. It might be that Argentina is going to collapse on itself, and it's hard not to see the American system collapsing on itself, because no one who should know better and is in a position of power, and I say no one, hardly anyone, is willing to stand up and defend first principles and to insist on standards being upheld